The PlayStation Portable, or PSP for short, was a very beloved system in spite of all of its issues. It was a music player, a movie player, a portable media storage device, and it was a fully fledged handheld gaming system at that. But by 2009, the PSP lost quite a bit of steam, as many preferred the DS for the many incredible titles that made it there. By 2011, there had been so many rumors surrounding the successor to the PSP, and this is all people really cared about. So naturally, everyone's expectations went through the roof. That same year, Nintendo launched the 3DS, a system that was met by a lot of negative reception due to the price, lack of games, and 3D that was painful to use after a few minutes while having to hold it perfectly to get it to look good. With how poorly the 3DS performed at launch and the coming weeks since then, many believed that Sony was going to dominate the handheld scene. In 2012, we were greeted with the PlayStation Vita worldwide, a handheld whose legacy was failed entirely by Sony. Around 2010 and early 2011, there were a lot of rumors surrounding what the successor to the PSP would be like. Many were hoping for a fully modernized iteration, even something akin to the PSP Go, which is a version of the system that slides upwards, but obviously a lot more powerful. This had been dubbed the NGP until Sony eventually unveiled the final name. In June of 2011, we got the full announcement for Sony's next-generation handheld system, the PlayStation Vita. Sony unveiled a host of new features for this device. The Vita is an outright upgrade in almost every single way to the PSP. This is the launch model PS Vita. It has a glossy material that is not glass but definitely feels like it. It's very premium, including the PS Vita logo at the bottom. The Vita is taller than the PSP, making it more comfortable for people of varying hand sizes. The Vita's D-pad is much clickier with a much more satisfying click, which makes it easier to use in many games, but it also has a very satisfying rolling function that feels incredible. The face buttons are much smaller, but feature that same clickiness from the D-pad. The Vita has stereo speakers on the front, which sounds pretty good, and navigation buttons are all on the front as well. One big feature for the Vita is the fact that it now features dual analog sticks, which now makes it much better at replicating the home console experience with a lot of games. A massive upgrade from relying on your shoulder buttons for camera controls, but these do not really click in, meaning that they do not feature R3 and L3 functionality and the sticks. Another massive feature of the Vita is the fact that it has an OLED display, which looks absolutely incredible. No other handheld gaming manufacturer had incorporated an OLED display into their systems by this point, and it was absolutely incredible. This allowed the blacks to look completely pitch black and the whites to look pure white. This display is truly a sight to behold, especially within the context of 2012. Sony also made this a touch-enabled display so you can navigate menus and even play games with this touchscreen. This is actually a 940 by 544 resolution display, containing almost exactly 4 times the amount of pixel density that the PSP's display does, while being double the resolution. This was actually great because it made scaling PSP games a non-issue on the system thanks to integer scaling. On the top, you will find a cartridge slot, sleep-wake button, volume controls, your shoulder buttons, and a specialized port. Sony transitioned away from optical media on their handhelds, now opting for cartridges. These cartridges were nothing super special, as they ended up only holding up to 4 GB of data, similarly to the 3DS's cartridges, but still a big improvement from the UMD's 1.8 GB limitation, and much more convenient to travel around with. That specialized port was just a proprietary USB port that never really received any kind of official use from Sony, so it remains largely ignored, although it was primarily used for testing and development. The Vita still gets another major feature that was meant to receive widespread usability, that being the touchpad on the back. With it, you can play games in different ways, making it pretty immersive for the ones that did support it, and in some cases it offers R2 and L2 functionality that isn't available through physical buttons. The Vita even features Sony's 6-axis control scheme from the DualShock 3 controller, which helped a lot when it came to getting good gyroscopic controls. The Vita also has a proprietary memory card slot, a proprietary charging port, and a headphone jack around the bottom. The Vita features 2 cameras, one on the front and the other on the back, similarly to the 3DS. These cameras were pretty low resolution, only being 0.3 megapixel sensors, but on the Vita, they allowed you to video chat and take photos. Skype was a pretty big deal at this time, and it was one of the many apps you could download on the Vita. Because the Vita has a revamped operating system, which shows all of your animated icons and you can download apps easily. You even get a web browser, native Bluetooth and Wi-Fi support, among other things. The Vita still retained a lot of the same functionality from the PSP, including the ability to store media such as photos, videos, music, among others, but you would be downloading them onto these proprietary memory cards. These memory cards were easily one of the worst features of the Vita that has nothing to do with the functionality. Sony offered many variants of these memory cards ranging from 2 gigabytes all the way up to 64 gigabytes, but this is not a ton of storage for a device that has a lot more digital aspects to it, and it was required for most games to save data or even download additional content. These memory cards were obscenely expensive, going from about $20 all the way up to $92. This was beyond unreasonable, and because it has a proprietary slot meant for these cards only, you couldn't use a normal microSD card, which was much more affordable. You were completely locked to Sony's ecosystem. But there were also other problems with the system, as it were. Sony launched 2 models of the PS Vita. The base Wi-Fi model would retail for $249, while the 3G-enabled model would retail for $299. These prices were high, about the same as the already complained about 3DS, and even higher for the 3G model. The memory cards and the unit price of both models were definitely disappointing. Many believed that the PlayStation Vita would overtake the 3DS, considering that the 3DS launched much sooner and it did very poorly. Gamers were upset about the lack of games, the crazy price tag, the jittery 3D effect, and the fact that it was certainly underpowered compared to the PS Vita. Sony's handheld did do pretty well at launch, but its sales were still behind what the 3DS achieved earlier on. Sony thought that the demand for it would be much higher, but it turned out to be the opposite. Both handhelds were receiving a lot of scrutiny for the many decisions made by both Nintendo and Sony, making this an uphill battle for both competitors. Now, while the pricing of the system and a required expensive accessory brought a lot of disdain from Sony's own fanbase, another major blow to the Vita sales numbers in the earlier years was brought by the games. Sony wanted to feature AAA titles on the Vita, which included flops, without a doubt. But the Vita was also home to some incredible experiences. The PlayStation Vita was noticeably more powerful than the 3DS, but it still wasn't really powerful enough to deliver the kinds of games that Sony wanted to put on it. If you look at the visuals for many of the games on the Vita, then you might agree that most of its games look like PlayStation 3 games with watered-down graphics. Now, one of the best games on the Vita that demonstrated the prowess of the system when placed in the hands of the right developer was Uncharted: Golden Abyss. This game was a solid performer, a franchise that had been stuck on home consoles and is now playable on the Vita. It made great use of both analog sticks and it ran quite well on the system for the most part. There were other games that were overhyped for the system, including Black Ops Declassified. This game was a poor performer that was visually unappealing, and it was one that many gamers would consider broken with terrible AI and simply did not do well at all on the Vita. This was a major title announced for the system and one that got the attention of many, especially around the height of the Black Ops series. Now, some of the best first-party Vita titles were Little Big Planet, Freedom Wars, Killzone Mercenary, Gravity Rush, Wipeout 2048, among others. But the Vita also received notable third-party support, including Final Fantasy X and X-2, World of Final Fantasy, Velocity 2X, Hotline Miami, Rayman Origins and Legends, Code Realize, Minecraft, BlazBlue, Persona 4 Golden, and much more. The bulk of the Vita support actually ended up coming from indie developers, thanks to the strides that Sony made around this time to ensure that indie developers would either make or port games onto the Vita, such as waiving the publisher license fee and giving developers access to the Vita SDK that made it so much easier to develop Vita games. Indie games thrived on the Vita, with notable mentions such as Child of Light, Spelunky, Shovel Knight, Action Verge, Salt and Sanctuary, among so many others. Another awesome inclusion to the PlayStation Vita is the ability to support remote play from the PlayStation 3, supporting some PS3 games and PS1 games. This was a feature that was greatly improved later on. So while the Vita was home to so many indie games, it lacked in what it originally intended: first-party AAA support. As a result, we did not get that many of those games ported onto the Vita. Many games that could have made it onto the Vita ended up making it to the 3DS instead, with Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate being a huge loss for Sony and a massive win for Nintendo. Over time, the 3DS was receiving a lot more support from third parties, and first parties were obviously very invested in the 3DS. Nintendo's offering started seeing some recovery, thanks to Nintendo's willingness to cater more to the consumer by slashing prices as soon as they could, and releasing a lot more games from many developers. Sony also slashed the Wi-Fi model of the Vita down to $199, but memory cards were still ridiculously expensive, and the release of major titles was slowing down. By early 2013, things were looking pretty bad for the Vita. In 2013, Sony announced the PlayStation 4, the next-generation console that would revive people's favor of Sony from the PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 1 eras of gaming. As Sony noticed a massive decline in sales from the Vita, their focus was primarily on the PlayStation 4. However, Sony did not abandon the Vita quite yet, even if its future was bleak. Sony announced 2 revisions of the Vita, with the PlayStation Vita 2000, or Slim, taking center stage. The PS Vita 2000 launched in 2013 in Japan, but by 2014, it was available worldwide. This is a very nice revision to the PlayStation Vita, removing some aspects from it to make it slimmer and also improve its functionality in some ways. The 2000 model is slightly taller than the original Vita, having bezels around the display. The buttons have remained largely the same in terms of the size and placement, but I believe that the original Vita has slightly more travel on those buttons, something that I've noticed through testing, but minor enough that most people probably won't care about it. The analog sticks have the same placement and are exactly the same in terms of the feel and functionality, but the start, select, and home buttons have been made circular, and they do feel better to press. The 2000 model still features stereo speakers, maintaining a very similar placement, but I believe that the 2000 speakers are ever so slightly louder as well. On the top, you will notice that Sony removed that proprietary USB port that never really got used by consumers, and instead simply gave us a cartridge slot in the middle. Volume controls, LED indicators for power and charging status, and sleep-wake button with the same shoulder buttons. The touchpad was made a little bit smaller, but the usability remains nearly identical. Sony kept the same proprietary memory card slot and headphone jack, but they replaced the proprietary charging port with a micro USB port, which is infinitely better. This makes it a lot easier for you to charge with whatever micro USB cable you have lying around, and most people had one back in 2014 since it's the connector that most Android devices used by then. Sony even managed to increase the battery life of the Vita by 1 extra hour, which means more playtime for you. However, the biggest drawback of this model is that they replaced the beautiful OLED display with an admittedly inferior LCD. This is still a quality LCD in my opinion, as they do a great job with color reproduction, but once you've been spoiled with OLED, it's tough to go back. The 2000 model is significantly thinner than the original, and I would argue that it is also more ergonomic thanks to the height increase. By the time Sony launched the PlayStation Vita 2000, they added a massive update to the PS Vita's remote play capabilities, allowing it to work with the PS4's entire games library. This added a lot more usability to the remote play feature, but after some time, the PS Vita was being marketed as a great companion device to the PlayStation 4 rather than its own system with its own games. This was troubling for the Vita, but it was still being supported. In multiple formats, may I add. But the 2000 model was a very viable option for those who wanted to give the Vita ecosystem a try, launching for $199 and was usually bundled with Borderlands 2. But there was still one more revision of the Vita that launched a few months later. The portable aspect of the PlayStation Vita added a lot of charm to it, but Sony believed that there was still more that could be done with the Vita, primarily to try and keep the cost down. This is when the PlayStation TV launched just a few months after the 2000 model of the PlayStation Vita. The PlayStation TV is a revision of the Vita, although it didn't have the Vita nomenclature in North America. This model was made to try and reach more customers in Asian territories for people who wanted a streaming device rather than a gaming system, or I suppose a combination of both for pretty cheap. The PS Vita is about the size of a small wallet, and it doesn't have a display, a battery, navigation buttons, or anything of the sort. This is a device that is meant to sit underneath your TV and is entirely dependent on other accessories to work. On the back, you will find a power button, a proprietary memory card slot, a USB-A port, HDMI port, Ethernet port, and a power connector. You will also find a cartridge slot on the side, but that's about all that there is regarding this system. You have to plug it into power, connect it to your TV or monitor, and you have to connect a PlayStation 3 or PlayStation 4 controller to it in order to use it. You get the same Vita interface with a lot of the same features and the exact same gaming capabilities unless you have to use the touchscreen. For the touchpad, you can just use your DualShock 4 controller's pad and you get access that way. This is a PlayStation Vita stripped down to its very bones and much more niche than the actual handheld, considering that it is not the best streaming box around, but it does have the benefit of playing most PlayStation Vita games natively. But this was a far cry when compared to what Nintendo was doing by the end of 2014. Nintendo was working on releasing their new 3DS models that supported one of the best JRPGs ever, Xenoblade Chronicles, and came with a lot of quality of life improvements, as well as having so many more games coming down the pipeline. The 3DS went from almost being a failure to being a handheld that a lot of people wanted. Of course, Pokemon obviously helped with that, but Nintendo just never really gave up on their system. Where the Wii U was failing massively, the 3DS picked up the slack, but the lack of support for the Vita and Sony constantly shifting the conversation away from it only turned everyone's initial excitement into disappointment, and soon enough, into a distant memory. But the problem really comes down to what Sony did with the system at the end of it all. If you owned a PlayStation Vita, then you probably loved it, even if you probably weren't playing that many games on it. But the Vita was still a decent device for a lot of use cases. Sony started off on the wrong foot by pricing the Vita the way that they did, and pricing people out of getting an essential part of the Vita experience by charging this much for proprietary storage, all in the name of fighting piracy. Even if they made it harder to get around the system, it just made the system either inaccessible to a lot of people who wanted to join Sony's ecosystem, or simply not worth it to those who wanted to keep giving Sony their money. You had awesome Vita games come in, and lots of mediocre ones with very little support coming from major publishers in the following years. Rather than doing more with the Vita, it felt like Sony was trying to move away from it just 3 years after it launched. Sony announced that there would be no more first-party games after 2015, with physical game production ending in 2018. It was pretty hard to find any Vita models in store around 2017 and 2018, with many retailers just wanting to get rid of the Vita entirely, and Sony simply not caring at that point. In 2019, the Vita was finally discontinued in Japan, and by then, it was pretty much gone everywhere else too. Meanwhile, the 3DS was thriving towards the end of this handheld generation, with the last 3DS model launching in 2017, a few months after the Nintendo Switch made its debut. But even then, Nintendo promised to continue supporting the 3DS line for a few more years to come, and that's essentially how the Vita became a third-party indie machine, and a great one at that. But Sony were the ones who allowed all of this to happen. The PlayStation Vita deserves so much more, and it was incredibly unfortunate that things turned out this way. Sony's legacy surrounding their handhelds went from being a well-rounded and genuinely great handheld gaming device to finishing off with few first-party games worth noting, with little attention given to it during its short life and so much unutilized potential. If you own a Vita now, then you know how capable this device actually is and how catastrophically dirty it was done. The Vita ultimately sold anywhere between 10 million and 16 million units, with multiple sources reporting different estimates. This is catastrophically lower than its predecessor, the PSP, which sold at roughly 80 million units. Since the discontinuation of the Vita, Sony has not really attempted to create a dedicated handheld, even though there are so many out there that would love to see them do so. The recipe for success was there, and with the right support and diligence, it probably would have been a much more lucrative system. I mean, look at this hardware. It's gorgeous. Then Sony's focus shifted entirely towards their home console division after the unfortunate performance of the Vita and their nearly defeated PlayStation 3 system. This ended up becoming one of Sony's most successful systems of all time, restoring many gamers' faith in Sony. We'll talk about this one once I've obtained all revisions for it, but subscribe so that you don't miss that mini documentary when it comes out. Now, thank you so much for watching. Leave your suggestions in the comments for future bite-sized documentaries, and until next time.